Good evening to everyone. Good to see many of you, all of you. Some of you I can't see because your cameras are off, but I'm very pleased to be here with Naftuli Moster and Anita Altman. Naftuli and Anita came to see me a few years ago as they were beginning to form this organization to actually for the benefit of young people in the Haredi community, the Ultra-Orthodox community, who do not have the benefit usually of a secular education, which is a right for everybody to have, but they are deprived. And Naftuli is going to tell about his experience himself. He comes from that community, and I remember when he came to my office and he told me his story. He told me how much he had to struggle in order to be able to go to college and to be able to be at the same level as his classmates. He really had to work very hard in order to be able to get himself a college education, and he wants for every child to have that opportunity and that right. So he's going to tell that story. He has, together with Anita, they have, Anita, as many of you know, is a very long time BJ member. From the beginning of BJ's restart in 1985, Anita has been a very central part of our community, a core part of our community, together with Gil, and she really understands what this is about, and has been working with Naftuli, and they've really taken this out in a very significant way. This organization, Yaffed, is now very well known. It's been all over the media, the great work that they're doing, and they are. There's a lot of pushback from very powerful forces in the state and in the city. Very powerful forces that do not want this to happen, including some of the mayoral candidates. You're going to hear about this. It's very serious. And I hope that you'll be able also to link all of this with what happened during the pandemic. The misinformation, the distrust, and all of that stuff that really put a lot of people at risk. So I leave you with Anita. I don't know if you want to add anything. This, by the way, was supposed to happen on Shabbat morning. What was it, March
14th.
March 14th of last year. They were supposed to come, Naftuli was supposed to come and make this presentation on Shabbat morning in our community. So here we are, literally a year and a day later on Zoom. So I'm very grateful for Naftuli and Anita to come. And Anita, I pass it to you, and then you will pass it to Naftuli.
I'm going to say very little because Naftuli really is the person who can very graphically describe what the issues are, what the experiences are, and the work that we're doing. I will say that it's not only that they should have an education or it should be available to them, but it is New York state law, and that law is being violated forever, and there's been no enforcement of that law. And so I'm going to turn it over to Naftali, and I'll say a few words before we close tonight. And I welcome everybody, and I'm grateful to Rolly, for giving us this opportunity. When he asked me on the week of March 14th whether we wanted to do it by Zoom, which would have been the first Zoom session of Shabbat morning, I said, no, we'll just wait until it's over, never believing that we would all be in this circumstance still. So Naftali, why don't you take it away?
Great. Thank you, Anita. And thank you, Rabbi, for having me. My name is Naftuli Moster, and I am the founder and executive director of Yaffed, Young Advocates for Fair Education. We're a nonprofit organization that is working to improve secular education in Ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic Yeshivas. So I just want to preface this by saying that whenever I speak to crowds, I realize that different people are at different levels of familiarity with this issue. Some of you have even met with me. Some of you read Jewish and non-Jewish newspapers on this issue and news stories, and others are just hearing about it for the first time. So I'm hoping I'm going to provide enough information that there's going to be at least something new to everyone. So I was a 20-year-old Hasidic boy when I had the urge to become a psychologist. Mental illness seemed to be very prevalent in my community and in my family, and yet it went undiagnosed and untreated due to the stigma and the lack of professionals in the field. And I felt that I would be good at it. I did not know what it means to be or to become a psychologist. In fact, at first, I didn't know how to spell it or how to pronounce it. The only thing I could say is in Yiddish, psycholog. I think it's also the way you say it in Hebrew. Nor did I know what college is or what getting a degree meant. But I did hear about a local school that is offering courses, and it was an Orthodox school, no less, a branch of Torah College. So I went in there and I proclaimed that I want to become a psychologist. They asked me if I had a high school diploma, but I didn't know what that was. So they had me go to my yeshiva and ask. So I did. My yeshiva gave me a letter that said that I completed high school, but it was no diploma, there was no transcript, there was nothing. So the college wanted to give me an entrance exam, which consisted of writing a simple essay and doing an easy math exam. But I couldn't do either. I had never heard the word essay before, let alone written one, and I barely knew any arithmetic. So they tried to coach me on the spot. And because they really wanted my tuition, it's a small school, they ended up admitting me despite my poor performance. I had to take some remedial courses, of course, but I was finally on my way to getting my BA in psychology. Only I still didn't know what credits are, you know, what a semester is, what GPA is, what prerequisites are, core requirements, major, minor. All of those things were still completely brand new to me. And the whole school system was obviously brand new to me because it was something I had never received any preparation, formal or informal in. In the meantime, I was also looking for a job without having a high school diploma or any marketable skills. My first thought was to apply to B&H, like many other Hasidic people do. So I did, and I got rejected. I did not get the job. I ended up getting a job offer to work in a warehouse in Newark, New Jersey, where I would schlep boxes all day long, send out deliveries. And I always like to point out that I wasn't prepared for that job either, because as a kid, we also didn't do any gym or any other physical education, or sports was prohibited. So I was actually a pretty scrawny little guy for the first time in my life, suddenly working very physical, holding 40-pound boxes on my shoulder almost all day long. But again, it didn't require any educational skills or knowledge, so I was semi-qualified for it. I managed to get into college, and I did quite well, but it was a constant struggle. Basically, weekends, evenings, just reading over and over and over, taking the same notes over and over, just so that I can kind of be on par with people who didn't go to a Hasidic yeshiva. Years later, I was in my senior year, finally taking Intro to Biology, a course that for most of my class was really more of a refresher from their middle and high school years. But to me, every single word was brand new. If you've read anything about me, you probably saw that I never heard the word molecule or cell or organism or biodiversity or photosynthesis until that moment. It was just brand new. So that's when it really hit me that my school and childhood had failed me miserably, and that what I had experienced is nothing short of educational neglect with long-term consequences. So now I'm going to go back a little bit. What did my education growing up look like in yeshiva? So as a child, I attended a Hasidic boys yeshiva in Borough Park, Brooklyn. It's not that far from probably where most of you live. So we were practically neighbors, living just, 20-minute, 30-minute ride. There we were taught Judaic studies all day in Yiddish. And then for a few grades of elementary and middle school, we got between an hour and 90 minutes of secular education at the end of the day. It was more like of an after-school program. It happened at 3:30 p.m. to 5 p.m. Again, if we were lucky, only 4 days a week, because as you know, Friday we would finish early for Shabbos. And when I say that we got a secular education, it consisted of basic English and arithmetic. Nothing else was taught. Neither the staff nor the students thought it was important. And even the few serious teachers that came, they wanted to teach, they quickly gave up trying when they realized that the kids are disinterested, and even the administration didn't seem to care or to provide them with the support that they needed. For instance, to discipline the kids and so forth. Most teachers weren't even qualified to teach the ABCs, let alone any grammar or math. So this was all in elementary and middle school. Again, 90 minutes at the end of the school day, basic English and arithmetic, only 4 days a week. Then in high school, our school days got much longer. We were in school for a good 12 to 14 hours a day, but no secular education at all was taught. Zero secular education. Instead, we spent the entire day studying exclusively Judaic studies, and again, in Yiddish. I mean, the text was in Hebrew, as you know, or Talmud is like Aramaic or something, but all of it was translated into Yiddish, which was the language that we spoke. So I often feel like my description of the issue doesn't do it justice, because many people, I'm assuming in this room, have a hard time recalling specifically what they did learn in elementary, middle, and high school. So hearing that someone didn't get a full secular education may not kind of resonate. So I want to give you some concrete examples of things I only learned in my 20s. So I only discovered where North, West, and East and South are when I was 21 years old. I had not heard the word algebra till I was 22. I had not recited the Pledge of Allegiance or the national anthem till I was 23. I had not heard the word molecule until I was 24. I had not learned about the 3 branches of government until I was 25. So I'm just giving you those few concrete examples, and you can basically, in your mind, just multiply it, right? Basically, the limited knowledge was just tremendous. So these are just a few examples that, I and many Hasidic Yeshiva graduates, I guess most, don't know. And it gives you a little bit of a glimpse on how utterly uneducated and unfamiliar we are with our kind of surroundings. In my early 20s, I briefly lived in a dorm with immigrants from Czech Republic and Spain and other places. And they were astonished and in disbelief at how little I, the American in the dorm, knew, and how I never heard of people like Elvis Presley, the Beatles, and of course, much, much more. So this is why when I was doing that introduction to biology course as a senior in college, I decided that something was wrong. And it suddenly occurred to me that the same way there is an expectation that parents provide physical care for their children, such as, feeding and clothing them, caring for their medical needs, parents should also have to ensure that children get a basic education. And at the time, I thought that I was the first to coin a new term, educational neglect. But to my surprise, after doing just a little bit of research, I discovered that I wasn't the one to coin the term. And then furthermore, I discovered that New York State had a law in place requiring all non-public schools to provide an education that is, quote, at least substantially equivalent to that of public schools. In other words, they could be better or they could be the same, but they can't be worse. I also discovered that New York State Education Department had clear guidelines of what must be taught in these non-public schools, broken down by the grade level and the subject matter. So I was in disbelief when I discovered all of that and realized that the law is so brazenly being violated, where tens of thousands of kids are barely receiving any instruction in English and arithmetic. That's in elementary and middle school, and then nothing in high school. So how is it possible that this was happening? Now, of course, I knew something about the political connections and power that the leaders of my community wielded, and they could, get certain favors from government officials. But to get the government to ignore something of this magnitude, that tens of thousands of children were being educationally handicapped for life, that was some, next level corruption. So I began emailing lawyers, and of course I had no clue, that different lawyers specialize in different fields. So no surprise, they all responded to me that this is not their area of specialty, area of expertise. Finally, one day, there was an incident in a Hasidic town called New Square, which is also just a few miles north of where you all probably live, where a man who prayed in the wrong synagogue, a synagogue that was not approved by the grand rabbi, was nearly burned to death by the rabbi's butler or assistant. And he suffered third-degree burns on most of his body. And at the time, there was a video going around of the family's lawyer doing a press conference and a Hasidic heckler repeatedly interrupting him. So the lawyer finally turned to him and said, this is America. People are free to pray wherever they want. And the heckler responded, no, this is Jewland. This is Jewland. It's not America, it's Jewland. In other words, don't bring me your American ideas. It doesn't apply here. Anyway, long story short, I reached out to that lawyer, and he met with some of us yeshiva graduates, went around the room. I organized 20-something yeshiva graduates. He went around the room. We all had attended different yeshivas, but all of them Hasidic in New York State. And our stories were remarkably similar, right? In terms of approximately 90 minutes of secular education, just English and arithmetic, and nothing in high school. Some yeshivas provide a little more than 90 minutes. Some elementary and middle schools even provide no secular education, and everything in between, right? But generally speaking, that's the average. So that's how we started. Since then, we've launched a successful campaign to raise awareness about the issue through a combination of such as billboards, videos, media coverage, and of course, speeches like this one. And we've also done a lot of advocacy and pushed the New York City to investigate yeshivas and for the state to find a better way to enforce its laws. So this is where I want to zoom in a little bit, because I imagine that some of you are private school parents or connected to people who are private school parents. And so I want to just, mention a very specific incident that happened or issue that kind of arose from this. So in July of 2015, we filed a formal complaint with the New York City Department of Education. We named 39 specific yeshivas. I think 38 of them were Hasidic, 37 of them were boys yeshivas because the girls tend to get a better education. And New York City launched an investigation. But the yeshiva community, the yeshiva leaders that we, that we're targeting, essentially, they kept stonewalling the process. And they refused to allow the inspectors in and so forth. So this is what happened on a city level. So it dragged out for a long time. I think there was a lot of corruption that we later found out. But in the meantime, we pursued other approaches, one of which was to speak to the state education officials. And when we met with the state education department, they said, this was Commissioner at the time, Commissioner Betty Rosa. She now became she was the chancellor of the Board of Regents. She now became the commissioner. of education. And she said that through better guidelines from the state, they can get better enforcement of the law. The problem is the law and the guidelines, they apply to all non-public schools, not just yeshivas, not just Hasidic yeshivas, right? And they went ahead and began revising the guidelines. Now, what I think our opponents did, unfortunately with some success, is that they got kind of like they riled up the private school community, the private elite schools, the independent, the Catholic schools, and basically portrayed it as though the government is just for no reason coming and intruding and trying to strip away your right to a private education, trying to dumb down your education, and so on and so forth. And so then the state released the guidelines. They filed a lawsuit. The private elite schools, the Catholic schools, and the yeshivas all banded together, filed lawsuits against the state, arguing a whole range of things, including that it's a violation of their religion and so forth. The court unfortunately struck down the guidelines, but only on a technical basis, that these are not guidelines, they're regulations. So the state had to re-release them. It's not a huge process. The problem is it opens it up for public comment. And that's when the private elite schools, once again, mobilized their parent body to oppose these regulations. They knew why these regulations were here. They knew that it wasn't going to be a big burden on them. It's just here to protect. It's just here to protect tens of thousands of children who are less fortunate than the kids attending these private schools. Yet they basically derailed the process. It's been dragging out for a few years, and that's where we are right now. Where the regulations are essentially in limbo. The state is, in theory, still reviewing it and still, taking the next step to adopt it, but it's been taking a long time. And one thing in particular that we need is more people in the private school world to speak up and demand that. Let's assume it's going to have a minor impact on us, right? It's going to require the education department, the city or the state education department to come in to all private schools, because that's the law. But really the purpose is to ensure that these tens of thousands of kids get a basic education, and basically it's worth it. The trade-off is worth it. So that's, essentially where we are. As you can see, our opponents are not resting. They pull every trick in the book. Some of you might remember a few years ago when the Senate was still Republican. It was Republican because the New York State Senate was still Republican, and it was Republican because one ultra-Orthodox state senator would be elected as a Democrat, but then caucused with Republicans and therefore gave them the majority. In return, they let him do whatever he wanted, including he pushed through an amendment to try to exempt Hasidic yeshivas from having to meet substantial equivalency. It wasn't fully successful because the wording screwed them up a little bit. But the point is, in addition to that, we obtained emails from internal emails from the mayor's office, in which it shows that the Mayor de Blasio, delayed releasing a report, a damning report about the investigation that we sparked, right? Which later, when they did release it, it found that 26 out of 28 yeshivas they investigated did not meet substantial equivalency. One of my friends did the math on that. It's a 93% failure rate. Now it's from a sample, so it doesn't apply to all ultra-Orthodox yeshivas, but the point is, of those 28 yeshivas they investigated, 26 of them did not meet the standards. And this is after 4.5-year investigation, and after it was found that the city promised the yeshivas they're going to go gentle on them, and delayed that report. So the point is, our opponents are not stopping at anything. They've got a lot of legal power, a lot of political power, and unfortunately, somehow also a lot of money. Well, I guess let me zoom into this. I don't know if you've all read the news that came out on Saturday, that private schools got $2.75 billion in this latest COVID relief package. And it was specifically worded where where those that are low income, so again, private schools that are low income, where do you find that? They get the majority. They get essentially preferential treatment, which means that these very yeshivas, the ones that are not providing a basic education, and frankly, many of which are not complying with any COVID regulations. There are no masks, no distancing, no nothing. They've been in school since, June or May. They're going to be getting the most funding. So this is what we're up against, an extremely, extremely powerful group that is stopping at nothing to ensure the status quo. So, one thing you've seen now, and this constantly happens, where we find ourselves in an election season every 2 years, or sometimes every year, because there's a city election, there's a state election, and sometimes a federal election. And the problem is candidates want to secure a block vote. And everyone knows the ultra-Orthodox Haredi community rewards, politicians that make certain promises. Mayor de Blasio, for instance, back then in 2012, 2013, the big issue was Metzitza B'Peh. Some of you might know Metzitza B'Peh is the practice. A lot of you are shaking your head. You don't want me to even finish what I'm saying. Okay, I get that. But anyway, Metzitza B'Peh is the thing during the circumcision that is a little bit gruesome. And at the time, there was a lot of scandal around it, and Mayor Bloomberg, prior to that, had implemented a very simple requirement that parents have to sign a waiver, and even that, the rabbis and the leaders refused, and they literally, it was like a one-issue referendum, so to speak. And that's why they went with de Blasio, who's on camera, that he basically promised the community he's going to do away with the requirement. He's going to instead work with the community leaders. He worked with the community leaders. He couldn't stop that. And it continued happening. Kids continued dying and suffering brain damage as a result. And then, so this was then. And now the issue is secular education yeshivas. So you've seen several mayoral candidates have already come out and basically promised the ultra-Orthodox leaders, we won't interfere in your education, even though it's the law. I guess, I don't know if I mentioned this, but since 1894, New York State has required all non-public schools to provide an education that is at least substantially equivalent. And the law is clear that it requires certain subjects to be taught. Someone has to enforce it, like every single law. But here you have mayoral candidates saying, I'm not going to interfere, I'm not going to interfere. In fact, one candidate who's trying to kind of one-up Andrew Yang went out and said, not only that, I think the state has to recognize that Judaic studies, as taught in these yeshivas, satisfy substantial equivalency, basically making a mockery of any kind of standards, because it's like, okay, from now on, if a kid plays video games all day, maybe they've gotten a substantially equivalent education. Like, what is it still that is required if you say that teaching Torah, Talmud, halacha, and so forth constitutes substantial equivalency? So the point is, I think this is a particularly important message for this community. We need elected officials and mayoral candidates and other candidates to hear from you. If it's up to me, I would ask my Jewish brothers and sisters outside of the Haredi community to maybe make this a priority. Make this your single issue vote. You know, there are going to be plenty of people out there, plenty of progressives, plenty of liberal Jews who are going to care about Black Lives Matter, who are going to care about immigrants at the border. Not that we shouldn't care about it, but we've got, you know, like what's the expression? The poor of your own, you know, come first, or something like that. But the point is, your brothers and sisters need your help. Tens of thousands of ultra-Orthodox little kids who have no voice, they need your help. They might grow up to be like me. And if we do something now and ensure they get an education, then hopefully they're not going to grow up like me, right? Because they'll have access to the education that I didn't get. But otherwise, this is just going to continue on, you know, on and on and on. A lot of people often like to feel like, you know, let the Haredi community do whatever they want, doesn't touch me, it doesn't, let them implode, so to speak. I hear people say this. I think it's a horrible sentiment, but the notion that it's like, they're not bothering me, they're not, it's just untrue. As the rabbi briefly mentioned, think about COVID. What we've literally learned is that we all share the same air. We breathe the same air, so much so that it could kill us, right? And when one community disobeys the rules regarding health requirements, regarding social distancing, it caused shutdowns for people who behaved, who did everything right? And it may have resulted in unnecessary deaths. And so the point is, similarly speaking, when there's such a tremendous lack of education for the fastest growing Jewish population, probably in the United States, maybe even the fastest growing population, period. I'm the middle child of 17 kids, right? This is the fastest growing population. It's going to be the face of the Jewish people in just a few years, whether we like it or not. So do we want the face of the Jewish people to be, that of illiteracy, poverty, disengagement, from the broader world, and some level of intolerance? I mean, I think it's important for the whole Jewish community to stand up, make calls, send emails to this Board of Regents, to the State Education Department, to the mayoral candidates. And of course, we want to help you. So if you contact us, you tell us where you live, we'll figure out who your elected officials are, and so forth. We will make sure that they hear from you, right? And then there are other ways that people can help. I'm not here to fundraise, but it's always something that people should keep in mind. We are up against a behemoth, right? And you may have people connections at, foundations or other places where you can have an impact. You can get them to kind of make this their priority, right? So yeah, make sure you try to reach out to us. I'll put out our email. I'll put out our email address here. I'm putting that in the chat right now. Certainly, check out our website. Follow us on social media. I know maybe not everyone in this crowd is still on Twitter or Facebook, but it's very helpful when we get support over there. We get cheered on and shares and likes and all of that stuff. You could join us at hearings once we get back to in-person, although some of it is happening remotely. If you know private school parents, you can have them join this new group of private school parents who are beginning to speak up on this issue. I'm sharing the website to that as well. And yeah, so now I guess I'll open it up to questions if anyone has. And you could use the raise hand feature if you're familiar with it, or just maybe show us on your screen if you want to ask something. Hi, Jamie. I unmuted you. Go ahead with your question.
All right, great. It's great to see you, and thank you for the, for the rundown. I was wondering if you could go into back into the story of the scope of what we're looking at in terms of the size of the community, growth of the community, and what we're looking at in terms of the percentage of students in Brooklyn, in New York in general, who will be from this community and essentially illiterate in our very near future.
Great question. Thank you so much. And I see someone else in the Q&A or in the chat asked the same question. Elaine Klein did. The Hasidic school age population doubles approximately every 15 years. We did a study, and you can find this on our website under the tab resources, that by 2030, 30% of Brooklyn's youth will be Hasidic. So again, by 2030, 30% of all of Brooklyn's youth, all of Brooklyn's school-age children will be Hasidic. Not just all of the Jewish youth or all of private school youth, 30% of the entire Brooklyn's youth will be Hasidic, probably about 1/8 of all New York City children. It's a tremendous, tremendous growth. And again, this means more poverty, more I don't love the word, but like more ignorance, right? And more dependence on government assistance, more dependence on UJA philanthropy and other philanthropy. So yeah, it's a tremendous growth. Growth is a blessing. We're not here to say that's a bad thing, but it just tells you what it means if we allow the status quo to continue, what the lack of education will do to such a large portion of New York City and New York State. Seeing some other questions. Mary Stephen Hagen asked about the substantial equivalency guidelines. So you asked what the outcome was of the stakeholder meetings. So this is actually where we stand right now. There was a stakeholder meeting in November and December. New York State is currently putting together a report based on those stakeholder meetings, and they're gonna present it at the upcoming Board of Regents meeting. So now is a great time to make yourself heard, to say, to let the Board of Regents know that this is important to you and that they have to move forward with these regulations. Another question from Mordechai Miller. Are there any yeshivas in the Haredi Hasidic community that do meet the state standards and therefore are examples of success? So that's a great question, Mordechai. There are, and including, and I kind of glossed over this, the Hasidic girls' schools, for the most part, are all meeting basic requirements. My own sisters, right, and I have many of them, like I owe them a little bit of any knowledge that I have, because they, went to the same school that I did, only the girl version, right? It was totally segregated, different buildings, but they got half of their day Jewish studies and half secular education, right? All through high school, which again, in high school, we got 0. And they would come home, they would sing, the names of the 50 states, the names of presidents, the names of capitals, and they would communicate in English amongst themselves. And I would frown upon it because we considered it tama, profane, right? But in hindsight, I have them to thank for the fact that when I started college, I was probably at a 5th grade level, not at a 3rd grade level. Yeah, so that alone is a model. And then there are some other ultra-Orthodox yeshivas, maybe not so much in the Hasidic world, but it's pretty hard to find a single Hasidic boys yeshiva that actually provides a basic education. I know, because I know some Hasidic people who try, and they call us, and honestly, there's very little to refer them to. But in the Litvish community, that's ultra-Orthodox but not Hasidic, there are quite a few. So there's plenty of model, yeshivas out there that these Hasidic yeshivas could learn from. Someone mentioned to me privately that I should talk about the amount of money private schools get. This is something that a lot of people don't know. Aside from what I mentioned about the CARES Act, Ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic yeshivas disproportionately qualify for a ton of funding from federal, state, and local government. So for instance, Title I is meant to provide extra support for students, public and private, who are not up to their grade level. Title III offers professional development. On the state level, you have busing, lunch, books, attendance taking, immunization record keeping. Those are things the government kind of funds or reimburses. And there's academic intervention services and so forth. New York City has a voucher program that many people don't know about. In other words, that many ultra-Orthodox families get vouchers they're called childcare vouchers, but really the yeshiva is their childcare provider. So that's another way yeshivas get money. So all in all, we in our study, we found that some Hasidic yeshivas, 2/3 of their funding is government funding. You can hardly call them a private school when they're almost fully publicly funded. And then there are also some misguided non-Hasidic philanthropists who for some reason pour in lots of money in some Hasidic yeshivas or other institutions. I mean, that's okay, but they should also ask for something in return, like meeting substantial equivalency. I see Susan Miller, so I'm going to unmute you.
I'm unmuted. Okay. So I went to the private school website, and I see that one of the people who's listed there is on this call. And I'm wondering if you can address a little bit more how you're approaching that, both for secular private schools and for Jewish private schools. I'm a teacher at one of them who, campaigned vociferously for those letters from the parents, and I was kind of horrified. So I'm wondering what kind of approach you take. Is it sort of approaching people one by one, or is it more institutional? And if you could address that in some way.
Sure. So what they're doing, there are actually two of them on this call, but I think they're coming and going. But basically, yeah, hi EY and hi Jamie. But basically, it's on three fronts. A, one-on-one, yes, they're definitely working on that. B, they're also urging private school administrators that if there's a second round of regulations, a second round of public comment, that they shouldn't oppose it the way they did the first time. So they're communicating with the institutions. And finally, they're also reaching out to the education officials, to the state education department, and say, look, you've heard from a vocal group of private school defenders, so to speak, but you haven't heard from us. We are private school parents, and we are horrified that that our schools basically threw Hasidic kids under the bus. So that's kind of like the third part of that. I'm going to read some of the chat messages. They're coming in fast, so I may not get to everyone, but I'll read it quickly and try to respond. Okay, so one question is, are there specific Hasidic sects this is prevalent? Satmar, is Chabad, which I have friends from, better than others? Great question. So there are actually dozens of Hasidic sects. I want to find, while I talk, I'm also going to try to find a document that I want to share with everyone, and it's relevant to share with elected officials and candidates. The answer to the question, the quick answer to the question is, unfortunately, almost all Hasidic sects have this problem where they over-focus on Judaic studies and almost totally don't provide basic secular education. And Chabad is the surprise, right? A lot of people know Chabad to be open-minded. You find them on campuses. They do outreach or kiruv. They seem very knowledgeable, very worldly, and there's some truth to that. And here's why: they travel a lot. They have non-Orthodox guests at their table, and so forth. But when it comes to secular education, the yeshivas, they are as bad as any, and in some cases worse. So Lubavitch has a large yeshiva called Ahalei Torah. It translates into the tents of Torah, and that's also known as the Rebbe's yeshiva. So that's the rabbi, the Lubavitch rabbi who passed away, according to some people. I'm only saying it because some people believe he's alive, but that's a totally different ballgame. Anyway, so that yeshiva is the most prestigious one, and they provide zero secular education, even in elementary and middle school. Even in elementary and middle school, no English, no math, and let alone any science or social studies. So it's important for people to know, and again, because I know a lot of people out there have connections to people in Lubavitch. Use that influence. It shouldn't be a one-way street, right? They're very good at fundraising from non-ultra-Orthodox Jewish people and foundations, I've found. But again, it means that the influence can go both ways. Someone else asked, maybe we should file a lawsuit. Someone asked about a lawsuit. The problem is that for a lawsuit, you need standing. And to have standing, you need to be either a very, very recent yeshiva graduate within the statute of limitations, which is before 21 or 23, or you need to be a parent who currently has kids in the yeshiva system. This is not like the public school. You can't one day sue the public school and the next day show up to school as if nothing happened. If you sue, even if you're not suing the yeshiva, if you sue the state or you're suing the city, but you're suing it because your kid in this yeshiva is not getting an education, you're going to suffer consequences. And the consequences can be severe. But at a minimum, they'll kick your kid out of the yeshiva. So you lose your standing the next day. What's the point, right? But of course, there could be more serious consequences, like if you're employed within the community or if you have a business that people in the community come to, they'll shut you down very quickly. And then, of course, it could get worse from there. You know, we've seen some of the beatings that happened during the COVID protests in Borough Park, right? And as I mentioned, that guy who was nearly burned to death for praying in the wrong synagogue, right? So there could be serious consequences for standing up against the leaders in this community, which is why it leaves us with with a tiny pool of people. Those tend to be parents who are divorced and left the community, and therefore their child is still in a yeshiva because the other spouse wants the child to be there. Well, the question then is, does the parent who left have any educational decision-making custody? And if they don't have standing. So the issue of standing is a constant issue, but we're always ready to file that kind of lawsuit. And we did help 2 individual parents file individual lawsuits. Also, when there was that Felder Amendment, which I mentioned during my talk, we filed a lawsuit against it on the basis of that it's unconstitutional. And we tried to establish standing for us as an organization. The court actually threw out the case because he said that we did not have standing, but it was still a useful thing to do because we got a lot of information out of it. And the state was pressured to release those guidelines that I mentioned. Who are the candidates for mayor who support secular education amongst Hasidic students? I just want to be careful as the head of a nonprofit, a 501c3, and I'm here in that kind of role. I'm not here to endorse any specific candidates or say to vote against others, but I can point out which one has taken a policy that is favorable to us. So for instance, Maya Wiley has come out very strongly. Anytime she's asked about this, she just says, the law has to be enforced, education is important, and so on and so forth. Carlos Menchaca, he's a lesser known candidate, but he also has said pretty much the same thing. Diana Morales has kind of like, you know, more or less said similar things, but she goes on to talk about how the entire education system needs to be overhauled, which I think is, yeah, you can have that position, but it's not related. Here you have kids not learning basic English, math, science, and social studies. This is not about overhauling the public school system. This is a lot more dire than that. So yeah, I mean, those are the candidates so far that have been okay. I guess Scott Stringer has avoided the issue. My sense is he's supportive. It would be important, as far as I'm concerned, it's important to get them on record because they follow through on their you know, campaign promises. I have no doubt that those mayoral candidates who promise not to interfere, that they would be more than happy to follow through on that promise if they were elected, right? So yeah, and it's not futile to try to speak to those candidates as well. I honestly believe if they heard from enough people, and you know, we organized a letter signed by 100 rabbis and leaders, some of you probably signed it, to basically tell the mayoral candidates, all of them, that the Jewish community doesn't agree with that position. You know, you're not pandering to the Jewish community if you say you're going to allow yeshivas to deny kids an education. I think it's important for them to hear it over and over from as many people as possible. The 2.75 billion, the stimulus, that's mostly earmarked for private schools with low income. Is that a done deal? It's a done deal. Well, how did that earmark, this peculiar earmark come to being? I don't know who Robert Klein is and why he's trying to get me to say this, but the story is very strange. Apparently Chuck Schumer insisted. So initially in the discussions around it, they were only going to give private schools something like 400 million or something. And because of Orthodox lobbyists, Chuck Schumer single-handedly pushed to bring it up to $2.75 billion. I don't know what kind of, I think it's like 20 times as much or something like that, maybe 10 times. But he knew it would be too unpopular if he did it himself. So he enlisted the support from Randi Weingarten, the president of the AFT. I know she's supportive of our issue. I would have liked for her to include a strings attached that they could only go to schools that are schools that educate kids, that meet the state law. I don't think that was included. So we're going to try to have a meeting soon about that. So that's another point. Like, you know, if you have any contacts with elected officials, whether it's Chuck Schumer or your local council member, state senators, like I think BJ is in the Linda Rosenthal Assembly District. It would be nice to get an intro. I've actually tried a little bit. It hasn't been so easy because we're also pushing for legislation that would basically do that. It would tie meeting substantial equivalency to getting funds. In other words, these yeshivas get a lot of state funding. If we can include a provision that says that when you apply for funding, you must certify that you meet substantial equivalency. If you don't, then you don't get funding. If you've lied and you're caught, you lose your funding and you're barred from applying or receiving funding for 5 years. It's a common sense piece of legislation, right? I've spoken to some legislators and they were surprised that that doesn't already exist in the law, right? That you can actually get funding without certifying that you meet substantial equivalency, right? So that's a piece of legislation we're pushing right now. So it would be wonderful if someone like Linda Rosenthal, who fought some of the same opposition with regards to the Child Victims Act, which was around sexual abuse. So, you know, again, any introductions to your elected officials, or just write to them on your own about how important this is to you. That link that I shared before, it's a PDF. You can download it and share it with them, because we also find that some elected officials are afraid to speak about the issue. They're afraid to say something, the wrong thing, right? Like when de Blasio, after 7 years of being mayor, was criticizing a Hasidic funeral by saying my message to the Jewish community, right? That was dumb. He should know better. But anyway, we're trying to help candidates and elected officials avoid these kind of pitfalls. So, you know, it's a lot about, you know, what are some of the facts, the terminology to use and so forth. And similarly, we just put up a blog post that kind of very clearly distinguishes between the different types of orthodoxy, so that people don't just you know, make a broad statement about, you know, the Orthodox Jews, you know, without being clear about where the problem is. So I'm actually going to drop that link as well in the chat. And yeah, feel free to share it and visit our website, which is under construction, but in a good way. It has a lot of new information. Yeah, please speak to as many people as possible. I know Anita wanted to close out, so I'm going to turn it over to her.
Hi, sorry. This is, you know, quite a story. And I think that for many Jews, and certainly for many New Yorkers, it's been kept very quiet until Yaffed came on the scene and really put this into, helped educate, first of all, that, you know, elected officials about the fact that there were laws that were not being enforced. One of the things that I'd like to clear up that Naftali was talking about is the state education department has the ultimate responsibility, but it's at the local level, the Department of Education's, the, you know, boards in districts around the state are the ones who are actually responsible for reviewing and helping to identify whether schools are meeting the requirements, which has just not been happening. And in fact, when Naftali started, he reached out to district superintendents in New York City who, I mean, knew nothing about it. I mean, it was just not on anybody's radar screen. So it's a very significant issue, as you know, for me, that a notion of a third of Brooklyn's school-age children will be Hasidic in a very short time is really startling. And I think we as a Jewish community have a responsibility to stand up and be counted. One thing I would urge you to do, if this issue has at all spoken to you, is to go on the Yaffed website and sign, you know, and join us. I mean, so that you can get, you know, updates. There's a ton of information. And what is so remarkable, you know, I've characterized Yaffed as the little engine that could, because when I joined as on the board and was made board president, it was basically Naftuli Moster who was the staff. And we have been very fortunate that there have been some philanthropists, Jewish donors who've really gotten the fact of the importance of this issue and have enabled us to build the capacity of our still relatively small organization taking on a real behemoth. I would urge you, you know, many of us are donors to Jewish organizations. Ask them, you know, express to them that you've now learned about this, that you are very concerned, and where are they on this issue? The reality is we need to have more organizational support. We need people, and we need the organized Jewish community to say this just cannot continue. There's too many lives at stake. It's very bad for those individual kids. It's really bad for the Jewish community and for the larger community. I mean, it wasn't only the COVID crisis that raised the issue of, you know, the lack of education, the ignorance of science, but remember the measles epidemic that took place just the year before, which really comes out of really having very limited understanding of science. So I want to just close by saying, please, if this moves you at all, go to www.yaffed.org. Take a look at the website. It is still information, but there's a ton of information. And keep in touch with us. And we do reach out to people when the regulations were open for public comment. You know, we reached out to the people who were on our list. So join our list if you would. And also, please remember, when you're making that donation, add a little note in. Where do you stand? What is this about? Where's your voice? This is how I feel. So I thank you very much for joining us this evening. You know, I love this community, and I felt it was really important for you all to understand, you know, what was really happening on the ground. So good night, sweet Pesach, and thank you very much, Naftali.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.